Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the US and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, for government, and for for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we're going to share some of our insights, experiences, and knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice. And today, our focus is going to be on systems thinking.
Yeah, systems thinking, as we use it, is really similar to the concept of family systems work in family therapy, where we treat the whole family rather than just one patient. But we apply this concept to whole organizations when we're doing work with implementing sites for creating presence.
Yeah, maybe I should define what we mean by a system. It's a set of interconnected elements that are, and this is the important word, interdependent. So that change in one element or any elements changes their relationships to each other and therefore produces change in the whole system in some way. So I think to understand what systems thinking really is, it's helpful to think about, well, what else other kind of thinking is there? And I think the word that springs to mind most readily for me is linear thinking. So when we are thinking in a linear way, we break things down into their separate parts, and we're most concerned with those parts. And it might be what's wrong with them and, how to fix them. And there's nothing essentially wrong with that kind of thinking. It's like if you just had a dinner party, this happened to me last weekend. If you just have a dinner party and your kitchen is a mess, linear thinking is a way to solve the problem of a dirty kitchen. One dish at a time, one counter at a time. But then two of my pals come into the kitchen and they're much better at cleaning the kitchen, only they don't know where everything goes. So everything becomes much more complex, right? They came in to help, but they're really not familiar with with my kitchen. So we have become a system. And that makes things much more complicated. So the problem is that linear thinking just doesn't work well as soon as you have to deal with anything or anybody that is alive.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to our conversation in previous podcasts about really understanding organizations as living systems because they're made up of humans. And when we're looking at problems that often affect organizations, things like low morale or low productivity or inefficiency, we are really likely to make the mistake of thinking that these problems are being generated from things that are happening within the individuals, right? Like that this is an individual problem with person A and person B and person C. But systems thinking really helps us look at what's happening between the individuals as the likely source of the problem. And that can be a lot more helpful in actually finding solutions.
Exactly. When we're using systems thinking, we focus on parts only as part of the whole. We're looking for patterns so that if something has gone wrong, what's happened? How can we understand the problem by basically pausing and looking at the whole picture, not just a part, to figure out the best way to move ahead?
I do a lot of work in therapy with families. So I see couples, I see individuals, but my favorite work is with families. And it's really common when I work with families for a family to come in and they've sort of identified one person as the problem, right? Like when I say, what brings you in? They're like, our kid is the problem. Like it's almost always the kid. Um, and typically it's about that child's behavior. And when I'm using that family systems orientation, what we're really looking at is that the behavior of the one person who's identified as the problem is really more likely a symptom or an expression of something else that's going on in the system. And that thinking is really helpful, not just when I'm doing work with families, but equally in my coaching work with our implementing sites for creating presence, trying to really understand problematic behavior that may show up in staff or in departments or by the clients or patients in the same way as kind of being curious about whether it's a symptom of some other problem in the system. And often, the parallel is in family therapy, we see that there are often issues in, between the parents that are sort of manifesting in the child's behavior. Sometimes in our organizations, there are problems within the leadership team that are manifesting in these other parts of the organization. And so zeroing in on those relationships can be really helpful.
It's so important because too often when a problem arises, we think that if we just find somebody to blame and get rid of that part or person or get them fixed somehow, then everything will be fine. But the result of that, as you're pointing out, is that we often end up oversimplifying what is actually a really complex problem. So instead of solving the problem, it makes everything worse. And why? Because living systems work on feedback loops. They are complexly interdependent. They always having to be readjusting to any change that's made, balancing all the different elements, which is called achieving homeostasis.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that we think it's so important to use systems thinking when we're working with organizations is that people think and behave one way when they're operating as individuals, but they can be so completely different when they're working within a group or a system. And I see this a lot because I teach a really cool class at Columbia. It's a service learning class in the School of Public Health, the Mailman School at Columbia University. And the whole class is about group projects. And it's really startling. We ask people to fill out these reflections at the end of the course about what they learned about themselves as students by doing this group project. And the insights are almost always about the group dynamics, right? It's some about the skills and the information, and that part's really cool. But most of what they take away is like, who was I in this group? And how did I, become this person when I was working on this project with these other people? And that insight is really important. And I think it's also so, not just for personal growth, but when we think about how to help organizations, we really need to understand some of the vulnerabilities that, you know, manifest in individuals when they are in groups.
Exactly. We all like to think that we are independent, thoughtful, thinking people, and we're not going to be influenced by, whatever's going on in a group. But we forget that we are originated as a social species. Individuality is pretty recent in human development. So we evolved to work in groups. So that makes us very susceptible to group influence. And that is greatly increased under stress. So
Right.
when groups of people are stressed, they can have a lot of programs with how they think, feel, and behave. So let's look at some of those, a couple of those. First one, people need to know that we have mirror neurons in our brain. And that's how we relate to each other, how we know what somebody else is feeling by looking at their face, hearing what they say, seeing their posture. It's a problem with email because you don't get all that information. So
Right.
people have a lot of fights on email because they don't get that information. Anyhow, what it leads to though is emotional contagion in a group. It means that we will automatically mimic and synchronize our faces and our words and the tone that's in our voices and the postures and the movements that we make with another person. And when we do that, we feel the same thing they feel. So we pick up each other's emotions, which if they're really positive emotions can be wonderful, but can cause big trouble if people are angry or really sad. And usually we don't even know it's happened. It's automatic and unconscious. And then there's group affiliation. Since we're the most social of all species and our individuality emerged out of our primary group identity, which is with a family, our family, whenever there is any danger, whether it's real or imagined danger, we get closer to whatever group we have an affiliation with. And that can be a very good thing, or it can be a really problematic thing in any number of ways. Some of the ways include groupthink. Nobody wants to feel like an outcast. So when a group comes to make a decision, particularly under stress, it happens when everybody latches onto one idea and can't come up with anything else. And then everybody tries so hard to agree with each other that they basically don't even consider any dissenting points of view that might better inform the decision. And
Yes. Oh, Sandy, I'm
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
It occurred to me. I've been really trying to be more aware when I'm in a group, that I find myself being more likely to latch on to an idea from someone if I like them and feel connected to that person, right? Like I have found there are times when you and I talk, when we have meetings within our group, I have to be really thinking about like evaluating the idea instead of being like, oh, well, Sandy thought that was smart. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely smart.
Yeah, exactly. And the opposite is true too. You're with somebody you really don't like very much or you don't trust or something like that, then you're going to object even if it's a good idea. And the group may just go along with you because they don't really like this person either. I mean, all kinds of things can happen as a result of group think that actually can be disastrous for the organization, for the group. Then there's conformity. This is when people go along with what everyone else says, even when they disagree. So when this is happening, a person will change their opinion, not because they actually believe something different, but because it's less stressful to just
Right.
go along with the group. And when they've done experiments with this, people said what they really thought most of the time, but 70% of people changed their real opinions at least once to conform to the group, and a third went along with the group half of the time.
Wow.
And there's social influence. This is when a person's private judgment is unlike the judgments expressed by other people. So the person abandons their own judgment, even though it might be correct. It might be the best way to go, which is really problematic. And that problem can be attenuated with just one other person going along with that person and saying, yeah, that's a good idea that you had. And that may move the whole group in a different direction. And then there's one I know we love, loafing.
Yes.
Oh, that's just so aggravating. That's when a member of a group goes, yeah, they've got this. I don't have to do anything. And they basically get a free ride from the work of everybody else. That really has to be dealt with in a group, or a lot of bad feelings will emerge.
Well, and I had a couple of my students in the last iteration of this course write about the experience of social loafing, and feeling like there were certain members of the groups who just didn't participate. And it was really interesting because in the reflections of the people who were identified as doing the social loafing, they talked about feeling like they were excluded from the beginning. And so when their voices were shut down, their reaction was to just withdraw. And
Yeah.
so it can be experienced by different people in the group in different ways.
Yeah. That's so important, I think, for people to understand, because that's something you can address early on in a group process and help that person be fully integrated into the group process. Is much more rewarding. And then the issue of group polarization. This is when people will swing all the way to the other side of an argument and only one side, instead of finding a middle ground where we could come together. And really, this is what's going on in our country now, everywhere. And it's really dangerous to social health and well-being.
Well, because we know that people are vulnerable to the influence of groups, we make a point in creating presence to teach about these phenomena and also do some targeted work with leadership teams to prevent them from happening. And we teach some group engagement skills like building consensus, and another one that you can Google called the 6 hats technique. But we also begin with helping leaders understand their own vulnerabilities and exploring their personal styles and tendencies in groups. And I find it really helpful to ask at the beginning of work together in groups, what makes you feel respected? Um, and what's your working style? And I think articulating that can be really helpful in setting some expectations. So, when I think about what that looks like for me, I feel respected when I'm invited to contribute. I feel respected when someone asks me for help. I know this may sound kind of strange, but I really appreciate having my ideas challenged rather than having them dismissed. And it also feels really important to me to have a fair division of labor. And fair doesn't necessarily mean everyone does the same. It means people contribute what they're good at. That feels really important to me. And then, with regard to working styles, I really like brainstorming with other people and then going off and working on my own. And I feel like that's how you and I work best together. Um, Also having a really clear outcome, but being given creative license to figure out how to get to that outcome and having clear timelines. So, that's what I often bring to that conversation. And I'm always really interested in, what's similar for the other people I'm working with and what's different. What do other people need? Because we may need to adjust a little bit.
Yeah, and it's so important to have people who have different styles of that. So you get all of the aspects of the problem can be addressed because you're different people looking in different ways. So there are clues that a problem is a system problem. One of them is the time people are putting in to fixing a problem is way more time than it should take to fix the problem. That's a clue that You're not looking at the whole issue.
Yeah, I encountered this in my organization where I do outpatient work around the issue of timely documentation of notes, right? It's a big deal. We need to get our notes in within 24 hours. They need to be, aligned with a particular format. And every week, every month, we get this ugly report that says like these are the notes that are missing. And we spend so much time trying to persuade people to get their notes done. And I think looking at it from a systems perspective, what occurred to me is that the notes don't really connect with the sense of value for us as clinicians, right? We care so much about what we're doing in the sessions and whether people are, making progress and all of that kind of stuff. And the notes part doesn't feel so important. And I think really kind of understanding, that that's the focus, that what the administration is looking at is not like the good work we're doing. They're asking about like this annoying part. Um, that that's where I think the disconnect is. And so one of the things that we're trying is in making this note problem go away is to really look at celebrating successes for people in their clinical work rather than just the documentation part.
Now totally makes sense, right? I mean, the notes should be of value to the process of the whole therapeutic venture, not just to tick a box.
Right.
Then there's the one where people spend their time, like there'll be a meeting and 3/4 of the meeting will be spent complaining about the problem, not addressing the problem in any constructive way. I bet you've had meetings like that.
Oh, absolutely. Where, we're really looking at, what is the problem and how do we work on solving the problem? And we end up spending all of our time talking about like, well, this is how the problem affects me, and this problem showed up over here too, and this way of fixing it hasn't worked. And then you sort of run out of time, and we're like, okay, we have 10 minutes left. What are we going to try? And by then everyone's just sort of in this negative headspace and doesn't really have much energy left for it.
Right.
So in creating presence, we really try to focus on some problem solving skills that look at imagining what we want to see as the positive outcome, like what's the change, envisioning the change and the result as a way of getting people engaged in the conversation in a completely different way, motivating people towards solutions instead of orienting them towards the complaints.
Another clue that that's what's happening is they keep trying to fix the problem and nothing works.
Yeah, I've seen this a lot, particularly around the issue of parking at one of the organizations where I worked. They even went so far as to build another parking lot so that people wouldn't park in these designated spots. And again, this was one of those situations that was really about value. People were parking where they weren't supposed to park, not because there weren't enough spaces, but because they felt like this sense of inequity, that there were these spots that were designated for board members who were really only there once a month. And so I think it was like a little bit like an act of rebellion rather than, an issue. And so the systems problem was again about value and helping people experience their sense of worth.
And this is especially likely to happen when everybody sees the problem, everybody actually knows what it is, but nobody wants to talk about it, usually because they're afraid to talk about it, that there'll be something bad will happen, right? And that would be, like addressing that there are board members spots that are only once a month. That could get you into a lot of trouble, right? So
Exactly.
So you better not do that. And how about when the problem, it seems to be predictable, just keep the same thing happening over and over and over again, and yet it never gets addressed.
Yeah, I think about the issue of lateness and call outs for staff in May and June. And I think for years, we as a leadership team in this organization where I worked, we're like, well, it's sunny and people want to go to the beach or people want to just take time off and be outside. And maybe there's some truth to that. But I think the bigger issue was not about like individual motivation for people. It was a systems issue. May and June is when we reevaluate our budgets. And there are lots of conversations about, what programs are going to lose some funding or whether or not people are going to get raises. And that stirs up a lot about people's feelings of their own worth. So that becomes then, an issue that again gets kind of acted out by people within the system, but really represents an issue at the leadership or systems level. How are we helping people feel valued? And if you don't feel valued, why are you going to show up either on
Right.
time or at all?
And that ties into the issue of not really wanting to solve the problem, because it brings up so many other problems that are really too much for people to handle. And so they just pretend we're going to fix something when really we don't actually fix it.
So thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. When we come back, Sandy and I are going to talk about how we look at organizational trauma histories and some of the enemies of systems thinking. We'll be right back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy, and today our focus is on systems thinking.
When we were talking in our last segment about some of the parallels between family work and individual work and organizational work, it really made me think about how important it is to get a trauma history, right? When we are working to help individuals or, families manage symptoms and recovery from trauma exposure, we ask a lot about what's happened. But we don't usually do that when we are talking about organizations. And the history, the historical trauma that organizations have experienced, or sometimes even been part of creating for other people, those are really important to think about too. So in coaching sites that are implementing Creating Presence, I always think it's really important to do some reflection and historical work. When I'm working with organizations who are doing residential care, a lot of them were previously orphanages, and there is stuff that is kind of embedded in their way of doing things that really harken back to that orphanage mentality. And I know when I worked in residential, we saw that too. Like a lot of our focus on kind of like creating a better life for kids and giving them a different experience was very orphanage oriented. And it inadvertently sort of made us less likely or less comfortable talking about trauma, because, we were sort of oriented to think like, this is what our work is. I also, I've shared that I am a foster parent, and I'll be honest, I have a lot of conflicting feelings about being part of that system. Um, Historically, this is a system that has been extremely racist, oppressive. It's been a system that polices people of color. There are kids who have died in foster care. And so that is part of, I think, the trauma history of being part of that system, right? For people who are working in it and people who
Yeah.
are participating.
I also think it's important for us to emphasize that what you're talking about goes way back.
Oh yeah,
right?
hundreds of
And
years.
so the people doing the work now walk into these systems and find that those embedded concepts are still in place and really don't know what to do often.
That's right. And I think that's so important because there's an element of shame or blame that influences that work, influences how we think and feel about ourselves. I mean, I said I'm really conflicted about my participation in this oppressive system. On the other side of that, I feel like, well, this system exists. There are kids who are in need, and I am, in a position to be able to help in this particular way. And so I think I do a better job as a foster parent because I don't deny that part of the history, and I don't pretend that it's not a living, breathing element of the system even currently, but that I feel empowered and really motivated to help change that system from within. We've also seen organizations who have had staff assaults in their programs, and that even though it hasn't happened in 50 years, and that assault took place at a time when no one who's currently working in the organization is still present and part of the organization, but the way the rules and structures are constructed, that makes people aligned with a set of values or an operating system that is really about preventing those kinds of things from happening again. I know in my organization, one that I work with, there was a situation where a staff member was arrested for grooming a child, and that was really traumatic for the organization. Luckily, it did not, the other staff members recognized this and reported it, and it did not result in sexual abuse, but the grooming itself was traumatic for the child and for the staff. And over time, what happened is that there was a rule that emerged about touching the children. There was a no touching rule. And I think, when you work with really young children, and this is a program where that was the population, right? Like 3 to 10-year-olds, appropriate physical affection, like side hugs or, helping them get dressed, all of that kind of stuff, that's part of the work. But the reaction was so intense that it showed up in, a complete no touching rule. And then another, a good friend of mine, who was working in an organization, and when he got hired, he saw a list of rules on the wall, and these rules seemed so bananas. The rules were things like, residents are not allowed to crawl under their beds and hide. And, residents are not allowed to stab other residents with a fork, like real specific stuff. And he was kind of like, what happened here? Right. And I think when we look back and kind of understand the trauma history, there was one little boy in this program who did those things. And so those became the rule, like, the rules that were made for Johnny. But then they became systematized, and they lived on even after Johnny was gone, and they didn't really make sense. And the messages that you're sending to young people when you're like, you can't go under your bed and hide, and you can't stab people with forks. Like, that's a really interesting messaging.
I think it's really important that those who are listening understand that these kinds of things that Sarah just described go underground. They're forgotten, or the people that were affected are long gone. And so they get buried. But just like in individual people, traumatic events in organizations continue to influence the way the organization functions. What's allowed and not allowed, what's the organizational norm can be radically changed by these bad things that happened. And to add to that, if it's been anything that has been shame-inducing or involves legal action in any way, then lawyers come in and tell everybody they can't talk about it. And they never come back in and say, okay, it's okay to talk about it now. So the traumatic events never get processed. They just go underground, just like happens in families. We see the same thing in families. And these are all, everything you just described, these are all part of what we call enemies of systems thinking. And you can hear about them in any organization as long as you ask the right questions, but especially when everybody's feeling really stressed out. And what you find if you pause and look is that our typical ways of solving problems are about saving time and saving money, but they often make the problems much worse because they delay and avoid finding real solutions. So looking for a quick fix, thinking one person is the problem and removing them, that's one enemy. Putting on Band-Aids, fixing only part of the problem, but not really addressing the real underlying big system problem. Focusing only on money, making decisions only based on saving it or getting it, often costs a whole lot more money in the long run.
I've seen this a lot. And I actually remember when I was doing a business school program for executive leaders, a certificate program. One of the first things they taught us when we were talking about budgeting was, if your funding gets cut, if you are, in a financial crisis, the first thing to go are positions. And this was a group of nonprofit leaders. We were all sitting in the room and we were like gasped. And we sort of pushed back on the professor, and we said, it's really hard when a solution works on paper, right? Like, my spreadsheet's going to look really good if I cut these positions and my new budget is balanced, but it affects people. And these tend to then, really influence the work that gets done, issues of morale, people's capacity. You can end up, if you are, if you cut positions and then you have people who are feeling overworked, overloaded, unappreciated, and devalued, and also fearful, like, am I next? Those are the people who are going to then leave. And the cost for hiring, training, onboarding, and bringing in new staff to fill those positions actually costs more in the long run than the positions that you eliminated. And so it's, it's hard when you are in that kind of bind to come up with alternatives, but just knowing the potential impact of that oversimplified solution might push us to think more creatively.
And it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. I mean, our healthcare system is limping because of it. I know a big healthcare system that laid off 10% of its workforce. Well, that's going to affect everything because it's a system, and you can't do that without it affecting the entire system, even parts that are far distant from the people that left. They're just not. It just does not work. Another enemy of systems thinking is urgency, right? It leads to panic-driven decisions, a reliance on authority figures rather than actually turning to people who may know the most, but may not be in a position of authority. And after a while, it's what you were just referring to. People, they become apathetic. They check out and say, I'm just putting in my time till I can get out of here. You see, there's a lot of that around in all of our systems right now. People are so demoralized because it's all based only on money. We need more information. That can be a delay tactic to avoid having to make those hard kind of decisions. And of course, oversimplifying, cutting out important information because it's easier really to think in simple terms.
This is why in our model, we spend so much time on complexity management skills, specifically to combat this tendency towards oversimplification and, really steer clear of these enemies of systems thinking.
Right. Another one is focusing only on like your little part of the world, your department, your just the people you work with, looking at what's good for me instead of what's good for the whole system. So without systems thinking, it's very hard to think in a different way other than just protecting your own. Another enemy of systems thinking is avoidance, avoiding conflict, avoiding the problem altogether because the solutions may be very difficult and may upset a lot of people. And then another huge enemy of system thinking is authoritarian decision-making, where one person takes control and decides and is not really using the most power they have, which is to try to get all the best ideas from everybody and then integrate them. And in authoritarianism, that doesn't happen. Can't happen.
No. Well, and there are lots of problems that come when we treat living systems like they're machines, when we use linear instead of systems thinking.
Right. And you see that happening when somebody else comes in and says, you have to do this, and you're not allowed to protest, you're not allowed to illuminate the problems, you're not allowed to make things more complex, right? And that's what happens when you treat a living system as a machine. Machines are not going to raise objections. But when human beings do, you better listen. When we treat living systems as machines, we then are likely to have centralized power and authority, that authoritarian issue that we just mentioned, where leaders are seen to be important as authoritarians. Decisions are made above, and then just everybody else below is told what they have to do. And so exerting control becomes a primary job of managers, just to make sure the rules are being followed.
Yes. What I see in our organizations is that this phenomenon that really aligns with the research, right? So research about job satisfaction shows that people have higher levels of productivity and higher levels of satisfaction when they have more independence. But often when, there's a problem, especially around productivity, there will be a manager hired to basically oversee people's work and really micromanage that work, and sort of the idea of building in these layers of accountability that are intended to help and make people more productive, but actually just create demoralized workforce and complaints about micromanaging.
And that makes sense from a trauma-informed perspective, because we know one of the hallmarks of trauma is feeling helpless. You can't prevent it from happening. So any situation that puts people into situations where they feel helpless and they have no control are likely to be toxic for people. No shock there. It's to be expected. But if you're talking about hiring people to operate a machine, then it kind of makes sense, because the machine doesn't have to learn anything. But people aren't machines, and people aren't owned by anybody like a machine is. So a whole issue of command and control language that you can hear in an organization, productivity schedules, slots to fill, re-engineering, speed, insubordination, precision, marching orders, the troops, efficiency, productivity, right? All good when tasks are very simple, when the tasks require a high level of precision and efficiency, when the exact same outcome is what you want to get every time, and when the human machine parts can be expected to be compliant and obedient.
And
but
that's
other times not so good.
And that's what I think is so complicated about using that language and that frame of reference when we're talking about human services, right? You and I focus so much of our work on social constructs and communities and systems. And when we're looking at social health and all of the types of organizations that influence social health, these become toxic. This mentality really creates toxicity because it doesn't fit.
The US Surgeon General did a report in 2022 and said that 74% of the workforce are suffering from at least one mental health problem, and 84% of those attribute much of the problem to their workplace. So this is no joke that these environments, our environments everywhere, are toxic for the people working in them. It's hugely important, and companies have to realize it's costing them huge amounts of money as a result. So let's look at what distinguishes living systems, right? All living systems are unpredictable. They're complex, they are complexly interdependent, and they adapt. They're constantly changing. And what's really important and part of the vital aspect of trauma theory is this notion of living systems have what's called sensitive dependence on early conditions. And for human beings, that's childhood. And that's what makes childhood so important.
I am thinking when you're saying this about this concept of early experiences, and in individuals we think of that as childhood, understandably, But it really just struck me that one of the things we focus on in creating presence is staff onboarding and orientation to the organization. And that feels like another critical point for, it's not childhood in the same way, but it's their early experience of the work, their early experience of coming into an organization. And so this is a helpful way, I think, to think about and frame the importance of that onboarding process. Even all of the hiring and early training that organizations do.
Right. And living systems, if you provide that basic structure, right, whether we're talking about a child or a staff member joining an organization, if you provide that basic structure and the clear articulation and modeling of values, you get what's called self-organization. You get it emerges for free. It's toward ever increasing complexity. And then I think it's important to emphasize the big difference between machines and living systems. If you throw a rock, you can safely predict where the rock's going to end up because it'll follow the laws of physics. Very different if you have a bird in your hand and you throw a bird. The bird's reactions can only be predicted by a set of actual probabilities, even though the bird is also affected by the laws of physics. But unlike the rock, as a living system, the bird has choice. And that's hugely important in understanding the difference between these top-down control mechanisms and really supporting people finding ways to work together in the best way possible. Because everybody has a lot of choices to make every day, and we have to learn through trial and error. That's how human beings, living systems, all living systems, learn. So you can, there's always going to be mistakes as long as we learn from them.
And I think that also is such an important part of using trauma-informed practice. And one of the things that we focus on in creating presence is managing mistakes. And, from a trauma treatment perspective, I feel like so much of what happens in individual experiences of trauma is an encoding almost of secrecy and fear about making mistakes. And so those two things together turn into like covering things up, trying to deny that bad things have happened. And the more we do that, the more likely those bad things are to happen again. And so becoming a learning organization, committing to being a learning organization means understanding that lots of what we try is not going to work, but that we want to celebrate the try and learn from what didn't work in order to do it better next time.
Right, at every level, because living systems depend on the constancy of feedback loops. And that's really how we learn things.
Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to lead in a trauma-informed organization. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. We'll see you next week.